Hello everyone, I am the Desert Gardener, and recently I was listening to a podcast, and the podcaster recommended using a granular fertilizer to feed your houseplants. Is that a good idea? Well, I've got my tea. Let's talk about that. Now, if you've seen any of my earlier fertilizer videos, in fact, I had one very long, in-depth one that I'll link to at the end and down below if you'd like to see it. And I actually recommended a couple of granular fertilizers for using in your garden for one of my more simpler fertilization protocols. However, is that really a good idea for your houseplants? And to know if it is, we need to look at a few things. First off, you've probably heard people say that if you take a tablespoon of garden soil, there is more life in that 1 tablespoon of garden soil than there are human beings on the entire planet. So your soil is alive. And what happens is when you put a granular fertilizer in your garden, the microbiology in the soil eats that granular fertilizer and breaks it down and turns it into something the plants can absorb. And they can't actually absorb these granulars. But once you put it in the garden, the microbiology breaks it down and it turns it into something they can absorb. The problem with that is when it comes to houseplants, there isn't a microbiology for the most part in that container in your house. Now, most people use a potting soil. And just to be clear, potting soil is kind of a misnomer. It's actually a potting mix. It's a soilless mix. It's usually made of peat moss and perlite and forest products. And there really isn't any life to it. It's completely dead. Now, there's nothing wrong with that for the houseplants. It's just there's no microbiology to break down a granular fertilizer. So if you add that, very little of it is the plant going to be able to take advantage of. Now, if you read the label on these, oftentimes it'll say that there's a small percentage of the nitrogen that is water soluble, but everything else is not. So if you add a granular fertilizer like this to your houseplants, they're going to be able to absorb a small amount of that nitrogen, but pretty much nothing else. It's just going to sit there and collect salts, which could be damaging over time. So it's really not a good idea. It's fine for the garden, but it's really not a good idea for your houseplants. So what should you use? Well, you need to use something that's 100% water soluble. Now, you've probably heard me talk about this one here. It's Kellogg's Organic Fish and Kelp. It's a 222 and it's completely water soluble. So if you add this to your houseplants are going to be able to absorb it right away. Now, there are a couple of issues here. The first one is this stuff does not smell very good. So I'm not sure it's really the best idea for houseplants, especially if you have a lot of houseplants like I do. Your house is going to smell like dead fish for about 3 days. If you're okay with that, then great. But if you're not, using a chemical fertilizer is fine. Now, normally I would never recommend using any chemical fertilizer, especially in the garden, because it kills the microbiology that we just talked about earlier. It also seeps down into the water table and does damage there too. So it's really a bad idea in the garden. But in your houseplants, it's an enclosed environment. There's no microbiology to damage, and it's not going to leak into the water table. So using a chemical fertilizer is fine for your houseplants. Now, the other thing is the amount. Now, if you read the label on most of these things, it'll recommend using a certain amount per plant. Now, these charts are usually meant for heavy feeding plants like tomatoes and peppers. Houseplants are not heavy feeders. You can really cut that down to just a fraction of what they recommend. In fact, probably 25% of what they recommend. And also cutting down on the frequency. Oftentimes on the labels they'll recommend using once a week or even more. I really only fertilize my houseplants a couple of times a year, and that's really plenty. So to recap, save the granular fertilizer for your garden and use only 100% water-soluble fertilizer for your houseplants. Well, hope you got something out of this. If you did, please like. And I'm going to be updating my video on blossom end rot. It's springtime here in the desert, and people are again going to be thinking about the blossom end rot that they may be getting on their peppers and their tomatoes. If that's been an issue for you in the past, please subscribe, and I'm going to have a much more in-depth, longer blossom end rot video coming up next. See you then.